welcome to folks joining via the recording. So I will show my screen. For a change, and in order to ensure that we get to it, we're going to talk about API issues first, rather than modeling issues. So last call, we sort of got to, I got through the modeling discussions, which were excellent, but then didn't get around to the API ones. So we'll put them first this time. So we have 3 specific issues that I anticipate will not take a ton of discussion each, hopefully, about linked nodes, content negotiation, and versioning. And then, apart from documentation, which I know I'm constantly behind on, what next steps we should be thinking about for the API side of this work rather than the modeling. So the first issue is 166. Back in 2018, Ethan asked, is there a policy about blank nodes? Because he doesn't, in Numisma, have URIs for every possible individual measurement or name or whatever else. It got discussed in Slack, but of course the Slack search service disappeared, so we can't see what was discussed, unfortunately. So we rediscussed this a little bit in Philadelphia, and I think the answer is you can use blank nodes, e.g. have a node in the graph that does not have its own URI, essentially anytime you want, apart from when the API requires that to be the top level resource in the JSON LD, e.g. when you dereference the URI, you get the representation of that resource. Clearly, in order to dereference it, it has to have a URI. But for any other scenario, any other case, any node internal to the representation, they can all be blank nodes if you want, such as names, identifiers, time spans, dimensions, and whatever else, productions. Antoine said if top level resource in JSON LD, which indeed is what I meant, then Antoine agrees. Thoughts on this one, anyone?
On the surface, it seems reasonable to me.
Mm-hmm. And we can always change these things. You know, nothing is set in stone until it is. So, any objections to this?
I mean, apart from dereferencing, is there any other problem that having blank nodes creates?
It means that you can't refer to that node separately from its containing resource from an outside system. So the scenario when this could potentially become an issue is in a third-party system that wanted to, for example, annotate the nodes directly rather than the representation as a whole. So imagine you have an annotation system and you want to say, you want to comment on a particular name of a person. So because the name is a unique resource for that person, there's no, from API perspective, there's no need for it to have its own URI because it's never referred to apart from that person, apart from these sort of third-party systems. So then you could annotate the person because it has a URI, but you couldn't annotate the name specifically. And if the system records hundreds of variant names for the person, then you would have to put into the comment, the name that I am talking about is such and such, which would be clumsy at best, given that we have the machinery to do this, relatively straightforwardly. But yeah, it would cause problems like that, but not within our sort of basic scope of it.
Yeah, but I mean, we're not encouraging that practice. We're saying that if you don't have your eyes for some reason, then okay, don't worry too much about it.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's a good point to emphasize, that you may not assign identifiers, but you probably, if you can, you should.
So if the API was able to, if there was a function of the API that we decided on in the future that only returned the content of that particular node without an ID, so that blank node, like by drilling down somehow in the API, then even though it might not be correct necessarily, it seems like the annotation system could record that use of the API as opposed to the identifier to target just that node. And that kind of reminds me of the problem of like image identification. So when you have a website and you want to refer to an image, there are a couple of use cases, I think. One is you're referring to an image of a particular entity, and you're saying, I'm going to use an API to get the latest image that's the primary view of an art object, and it's the first one in, if there's a sequence of these images, like for a sculpture, I want to get the earliest of those sequences, right? And so that is essentially giving you a reference to an image where you don't know what that ID is. And so it's kind of like a concept as opposed to a specific ID. But then there's other cases, in particular with annotation of images perhaps, or with creation of content that does need to refer to a specific image in time that was published, and where that URI does not change, then that's where you would have an ID used. And I'm wondering if there's a parallel between these two cases.
Yep. I think so. So in, maybe this is too annotation specific, but in the web annotation model, there are things like data position selector, which would mean that the thing, so this, to talk through this example, there is an annotation, it has a note as its body. The thing it's talking about is, in this case, a disk image. And you want to say, I'm talking about bytes 4096 through 4104. And clearly that byte range is not going to have its own URI to refer to. So this source selector pattern says, within this thing, then apply the results of processing this selector to pick out the bit that you want. For XML, it's easy. You can just use XPath. So in order to say, I want to annotate the HTML page and I want to select a particular span within a paragraph, within a table, blah, 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 then easy. But for graphs, there isn't a well-known, at least well-known to me, standard for this sort of thing. I guess Sparkle is about the...
There's a JSON path, which I've seen before.
Yep, that's true. JSON path would work for the representation. and we only require the JSON-LD serialization in the API. So that's a good point. So that would be one way potentially, but it does rely on some annotation-specific machinery to talk about it. But if that is the use case, then there is a solution. So
yeah, I'm not sure that's the only use case.
Yeah.
But I mean, if you modeled everything as annotations, I suppose, then maybe it would. But
yeah. So I think, let me know if I've misconstrued. Where we're at, you may use blank nodes, but should use URIs if possible. You must use URIs if the resource is to be dereferenced according to the API.
should we clarify when a URI should be used? Because that might be a little confusing. Like if somebody feels like they should create a URI, are they going to make up some kind of quasi-standard for referencing that based on the containing node as opposed to following some guidance that's in the specification? Like, for example, if they already have a scheme for representing that concept in their system, then they should use that URI, but they shouldn't just invent one for the purpose of putting one down. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah, if we say you should do something, then we equally should give some guidance as to how to how to do that in a reasonable way.
I joined late all this discussion, but why do people want to make blank nodes? What's the problem that they're trying to address?
Yeah, I think the issue with blank nodes is related to is the sort of the flip side of Dave's suggestion just now, that if you don't have a stable identifier in the content management system, then for the name, say, which, you know, I would be surprised if any content management system these days had internal identifiers for each individual name. Then it means artificially creating one in a way that's reproducible across different sessions or across potentially changing content management systems. And hopefully not related to ordering in case the list of names gets reordered and so on and so forth. So if I recall Ethan's case, it was something like that he could, he didn't want to go, didn't want to manage the overhead, the technical overhead of storing all of the URIs, because of the reproducibility question. Well, that was going to be his only way that he could solve the reproducibility question, was to store everything rather than regenerate it as needed. So yeah, just not having to look after the kittens once you've made them.
Yeah, and I think the point also is that in the CRM, to get from one entity to another, you might need to jump through 2 or 3 entities that in the content management system would be considered irrelevant. But from a modeling point of view, you have to create them. So it's maintaining all these extra nodes.
Yeah. Dave, for the guidance, should that be part of the specification, or do you think that would be okay as an implementation note? It seems to sit sort of somewhere in the boundary between the two to me. That we don't want to tell people how to do things, but we do want to help them to be successful.
Yeah, I don't know. I would probably err on the side of implementation note for now and see how it goes, I guess.
Yep. All right. Any further thoughts on this one? Okay, so move on to the next one. So the next one, Dave, was one of yours, if I recall correctly, which was, and a long time ago, though the date is wrong in the issue, 2019, so a year ago, was about content negotiation based on the language of the content used in the document. So to use a Canadian example, if there was descriptions that had an object that was described in both French and English, and you wanted the French version and didn't want the English content, then should we be allowing language, except language, language-based content negotiation via HTTP to say, I would like the French version rather than the English version, but if you don't have French, then give me English. Or should we just be silent if people use HTTP the way it's possible to use HTTP, then great, and if not, then it wasn't a use case anyway. My perspective is that we're not going to forbid people from doing it, but we don't need to explicitly call it out as possible. Antoine suggested that we could have a note about the possibility, but that it's not a best practice. And hence, we could alert people that this sort of thing is possible, but not go to any level of detail about specification. And so, Dave, do you recall, I know it was a long time ago, do you recall this discussion?
Not in depth. I believe we were talking about the content negotiation problem at the time.
Yep.
I'm trying to remember if there was a specific use case I had in mind or whether it was just a hypothetical.
Yep.
I don't know if this was a concern of the size of the response, that if you included a bunch of languages that you don't typically use, was it just overhead that was unnecessary and would be discarded? I guess the danger with this is if you're using, well, when you're using either a web browser or a programming library, you might get this specification or this header sent without you even realizing it as well. And so you would have to be cognizant that that should be removed in the case of where you wanted all languages, unless you're going to specify all the possible languages that you'd be interested in. But I mean, there could be cases where you just want everything. Is there a specification? Can you give a wild card on accept language, or is it? Yeah, I'd have to look in how that mechanism works, but
if I recall correctly, there is an implicit everything else default of the lowest priority.
If it's not present.
Yeah, if you can't give me any of these things that I've asked for, then give me what you.
Right, but if you're using a programming library that says, oh, your locale is United States, and it defaults to US English for the language, then you might just get the English, even though you really wanted the Chinese and the English together.
Yeah.
So there's kind of a, I'd say, in retrospect, I think if there is a strong use case that backs this, then it's something we could take up again.
Yeah. Bree, would you like to discuss that issue?
Yeah, I was just wondering, just off something that I had listened to at a conference where they were having to redo subject terms and all sorts of other vocabulary stuff because they're from Finland and they have two national languages, Finnish and Swedish Finnish. And so they have things in both languages because some people speak one and some people speak the other, but not both. So, and they were coming back with different resources based on which language it was. So I don't know if that is an issue that would be applicable in this case.
Yeah, I think the issue will be when the web browser sends the headers by default, and it gets back Swedish Finnish, but that either the server doesn't understand Swedish Finnish and gives back nothing, which would be bad, when they could have gotten Finnish or English or anything else. And the other time when I think it becomes problematic is if there's a rich client running in the browser that can deal with multiple languages more effectively than just saying, blanket, give me only Swedish Finnish. So yeah, if it can essentially swap languages in the browser, in the client in the browser, then having access to all of the languages for every field might be, although overhead in terms of size, to Dave's point, it could automatically generate some nice user interface that lets you swap individual fields back and forth rather than sort of a global, I only want Swedish Finnish.
It's been a while since I've done this, but it used to be that, I think it's still the same, that content negotiation in the server is done completely in the server. And I think you can, unless the client specifically says, only give me this language, it will have a default to one language or another.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't be something that we'd have to handle at our level, worrying about somebody wouldn't be able to get anything.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there are two cases that we should check. One, if nothing is requested, e.g. you don't send accept language, then I'm fairly confident it's up to the server to pick whatever it wants to do. And then if something's requested, but none of the options that are requested are available, then is it whatever the code is, 4 or 6, I think. Is it that nothing is acceptable and you get nothing, or is it that the server can pick something else? I think that's the troublesome case. If you ask for something and it's not available, do you get nothing or do you get something else?
And my only concern about allowing, well, about not saying don't do this, if you want to do it, go ahead, is that if we are saying that the responses should be complete, in that if you were reproducing the full graph by accessing all of the IDs, you would be missing out on a substantial portion of the graph because you wouldn't have all the languages that the graph included.
Yeah.
And so that's, it's more of like a principle, I guess. At the same time, I can see it being a useful API feature. It's just that it's not necessarily, it could be misleading if somebody is implementing a client for Linked Art and doesn't realize this at the very beginning when they go about doing it. And that's, yeah.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, at the very least, we should probably say, in the absence of an accept language header, then you should return all of the language data that you have access to. And then leave it up to the client to deal with internationalization for the user.
Yeah, I mean, even that's going to be potentially confusing. I mean, if we don't explicitly say in the specs, ignore the accept language header, right, then the casual navigator of Linked Art URIs is only going to see the language their browser is configured with, assuming that language is available in the graph.
Yep.
And is that a problem?
Yep. See, it seems like a problem to me personally, because given that it's data to be rendered, the chances of some normal human, as opposed to a developer, actively browsing through JSON LD seems quite low. The expectation is that there'll be some application interpreting the data for the end user, and that application can do the internationalization more effectively than the server. So thus, yeah, the downsides would be the size of, if we say ignore accept language, the size of response, if there's lots and lots of different languages representing the same knowledge, it does seem like a good optimization to only return the one that the client is going to render. So, all right, I think be silent is too permissive, and we should have something between the lines.
Yeah, and at the same time, you hate to like create another standard that does a similar thing, but in this case, it might make sense to do that should the need arise to reduce the number of languages in a response.
Yeah.
And you might also make the argument that the URL would therefore be different and explicitly filtering only on a particular kind of language in that case, so that it is obvious that that's what's going on, as opposed to being the canonical URI for that entity.
Yeah. So to get onto the last one as well, how about if accept language is absent, which is probably going to be the default case, or could easily be made into the default case using XHR, then return all languages and allow the client to sort it out. If it's present, then process linguistic objects according to the preferences of the header. So essentially not trying to work around HTTP, but being explicit about what to do in the absence of the header, which actually P, if I recall correctly, is not, it just says it's the server choice, if I recall correctly. So we're just saying, we think you should use this choice and return everything. I think that solves the two, well, it is a reasonable way of getting around the two sides of the argument. You can ask for everything and you will get everything if you aren't aware of this capability. But if you are aware of it, then you can use it. Any plus ones, minus ones, agreements, disagreements? Yeah. Bree and Dave are okay with it. John, great. Great. So then the last one is about versioning of the API. So Dave, this was yours, I guess, on or directly after the same call as the last one. That the API will evolve over time, so we should have some strong versioning approach. So I suggested that we could do the same versioning pattern as AAAF does with, which is just semantic versioning. So 1.0.0 would be major, minor, patch. 1, so the major increments when there is a backwards incompatible change. Minor is additional functionality, and patch is just we made some minor tweaks, probably editorial changes with no effect on the actual implementation. Let's go back to the. So then, Dave, do you want to talk through your?
Sure. Yeah. So I mean that seems fine, but I don't think it's sufficient. And the scenario that I'm imagining is, and it's explained here, is let's say we invest some money in a kiosk platform that is accessing our collection data via the Linked Art APIs, and that it's happens to be built against whatever the latest version was at that time, which was version 2. And then later we want to update our systems to use version 3. We don't want to have to go back and pay the contractor that developed the kiosk to revise the kiosk to support every new linked art version that we implement and deploy.
Yep. This seems like a requirement for the media type, and maybe this is only because we were just talking about content negotiation, but we could do accept, sorry, application LD plus JSON profile equals, and what we haven't talked about in detail yet was what to put there in the profile for the URI for the linked art profile. If that was the major version, included the major version in it, then the kiosk could request only version 2, and the server could then respond with, okay, I support 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, but here's version 2 since you asked for it.
And the default being whatever the latest version is.
Yep.
Which seems reasonable.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I think most of the time, most of the client uses of this are going to be programmatic, right? So as long as it's programmatic, then there should be an ability to set this header. And it seems reasonably clean, with the caveat that you just have to get into setting headers when you do it, which is probably okay.
Yeah. Which is, at least as of version 3, also what AAAF does. Where's the ECU? So now I'm forgetting exactly where the URI is. Oh, here. No, I've forgotten exactly where it is. But either way, for AAAF, the URI of a presentation API document actually is application LD plus JSON, and then the context. Here we go. So this changes with every major version. So currently in AAAF it's 2/context.json, and here it's 3. So if you did content negotiation for a presentation API document in AAAF, you can say, I want version 3, or I want version 2, or I want version 1, from the same URI, and a server that supports more than one could return exactly the right version.
Or what if it supports 1 and 2 but not 3? Would it return 2 in that case? Is that specified here?
I think we just reference we just point to the HTTP spec for what to do. I forget what happened, but
yeah,
it's the same. I think the same question as we had for the language, that if you ask for 3 and it doesn't support 3, do you get nothing, or do you get 2? If you ask for Swedish, Finnish, and you don't support that, do you get whatever is supported, or you get nothing? I will look that up before the next call so that we can.
Okay. It might be safer to return nothing. I don't.
Yeah.
Yeah. This seems fine, and it seems like it should be possible to create web server rules that would perhaps source a different application if you had a completely different implementation for a different version of Linked Art. You could direct based on the presence of that value, I think, without having to necessarily support it explicitly in your implementation and retain all those old versions. So that might, I think that seems pretty reasonable.
Right. So, I guess the proposal then is use semantic versioning and version-based content negotiation to manage cross-version software implementation. It's top of the hour. I don't mean to rush things, but are there any objections or not? We can continue to discuss it if people aren't certain about it, of course. And Dave, you're okay. So cool. All right. Call it good. So it's the top of the hour. Thank you everyone for coming. I will do my best for the next call to perhaps ping people who are normally here but haven't been for the last couple individually to say, hey, you haven't been on the calls recently. Here is the new calendar invite that probably you haven't noticed. Hopefully we get back to closer to the 20 to 25 people that we have had previously.
Sounds good.
Cool. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Yep. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye. Thank you.
Bye, thank you.
Bye.